A young real estate broker spends 14 months on a single deal. He finds the property, he works out what it's actually worth, which nobody else has bothered to do properly. He locates a buyer on the other side of the country who didn't know he wanted it until this broker explained why he did. He flies back and forth. He runs the numbers again. He absorbs the costs himself, because that's what you do when you're building something. And it works. The buyer commits. The seller agrees. The deal is real. Then, in the last few days before closing, the two parties discover something. They discover that they can now talk directly to each other. And a conversation happens that the broker is not part of. It isn't hostile. Nobody says anything cruel about him. It's more of a shared realization that the man who introduced them has, in a sense, already done his job, and that the commission he was expecting is quite a large number, and that this number could instead be split between the two of them. At the closing, the broker receives a fraction of what he was owed, or in some versions of this story, nothing at all. He goes home and works out what he did wrong, and he can't find it. He was honest, he was thorough, he was pleasant to deal with, he did better work than anyone else involved. That's the problem. He did everything right, and he lost, to two people who did far less than he did, and walked away with his money. And here's the part that makes it worse. It wasn't one disaster, it was a pattern. He would recover, find another deal, work it harder than the last one, get closer to the finish, and lose it in almost exactly the same way, with everyone involved perfectly polite about it. At some point, that stops feeling like misfortune and starts feeling like a rule you haven't been told. This happened to Robert Ringer repeatedly, over years, until he stopped assuming it was bad luck and started treating it as a system he had failed to understand. The book he wrote about it came out in 1973, sold over 1 million copies, went to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, and has one of the most misleading titles in business publishing. It's called Winning Through Intimidation, and almost everyone who has heard of it has it backwards. Here's the shape of the next half hour. What that title actually means, because it is not what it sounds like, and the misunderstanding is the single biggest reason people dismiss this book. Then Ringer's central claim about why results and merit come apart, which is the answer to the question in the title of this video. Then the framework the book is built on, the 3 types of people you'll do business with, and why the difference between them matters far less than you think. The 2 strategies Ringer tried first, and why both failed. What he means by posture, and the unglamorous mechanical thing he eventually did that changed his income more than any mindset shift. And at the end, the honest part, where this book is a product of 1973 and shows it, where its worldview becomes actively harmful if you take it too far, and the one piece of its advice that can bankrupt someone who follows it without capital. Start with the title, because if you get this wrong, nothing else in the book makes sense. Winning Through Intimidation sounds like a manual for bullying people, dominating the room, being the loudest, hardest person at the table so everyone else folds. It is the opposite of that. Ringer's argument is about being intimidated, about what happens to your results when you are, and what becomes possible when you aren't. The winning is achieved through the intimidation that other people direct at you, by not being affected by it. The book is a study of how to stop being the person things get done to. He was explicit about this for the rest of his life, and he eventually gave up on the original title. In 2004, the book was reissued under a new name, To Be or Not to Be Intimidated, because 30 years of readers had assumed he was teaching aggression when he was teaching immunity. Now, the original title wasn't an accident. He knew exactly what it did. He self-published this book, initially, out of his own pocket, after publishers passed on it. A provocative title was a commercial decision by a man with no marketing budget. And it worked, which is itself a small demonstration of the book's own thesis about how presentation drives outcomes. There's a detail in how this book reached the world that tells you more about Ringer than any of his theories do. Publishers turned it down, so he printed it himself, formed his own publishing company to do it, and then, rather than waiting for bookshops to discover it, he bought advertising, worked the trade, and pushed it until it moved. It reached #1 on the New York Times list as a self-published book in 1973, decades before that was a route anyone recognized, which is the thesis demonstrated on the book's own dust jacket. The manuscript didn't get better between the rejections and the bestseller list. What changed was that he stopped waiting for permission from people whose job was to decide whether he got any. But it cost him, because a large number of people have decided what's in this book based on 4 words on the cover, and what they've decided is roughly the reverse of what he wrote. So who was he? Robert Ringer was a commercial real estate broker in the late 1960s, working in a specific and brutal niche, bringing together buyers and sellers of large income-producing properties, apartment complexes, office buildings, deals worth millions, on which a broker's commission could be enormous. And it's a niche with a structural problem built into it. The broker's entire value is the introduction and the work of assembling the deal, and all of that is delivered before he gets paid. The moment both sides know each other and understand the transaction, the broker has, from their point of view, become an expense rather than an asset. Ringer wasn't unlucky. He was standing in a position that was designed to produce exactly what kept happening to him. Idea 1. The theory of intimidation. Here is the claim, and it's the reason this video is called what it's called. Ringer says that in a deal, the amount of money you end up with has almost no relationship to the amount of work you did, the quality of that work, or how fair it would be for you to be paid. Those things determine whether the deal happens. They do not determine who collects. What determines who collects is who was intimidated and who wasn't. He means something specific by intimidation, and it's worth being precise, because it isn't shouting. Intimidation is any pressure that makes you act against your own interest. The fear of seeming difficult, the fear of losing the relationship, the fear that if you insist on the paperwork you'll look like you don't trust anyone, the fear that a smaller share now is safer than a fight for a fair share later. Almost none of that looks like intimidation from the inside. It looks like being reasonable. And this is the answer to the question you clicked on. You keep losing to people who are worse than you at the actual work because the actual work is a different competition from the one that decides the money. You've been winning the first one and not entering the second. Ringer's own phrasing for this is that the person across the table is not evaluating what you deserve, they're evaluating what you'll accept. Now, the uncomfortable part. If you've been in this position, the instinct is to feel wronged, and the feeling is legitimate. But Ringer's book is not interested in whether you were wronged. He treats that as a settled and useless fact. His interest is entirely in the mechanism, because the mechanism is the only part you can change. He puts it roughly like this: the world is not going to reorganize itself around your integrity. You can be right about being cheated for the whole of your career and still be cheated every time. Idea 2. The 3 types of people. Before the framework, one piece of context that makes it land harder. Ringer isn't describing strangers. Most of the people who took his commissions were people he'd worked alongside for months, people he'd had dinner with, whose families he knew about, who had been genuinely warm toward him the entire time. That's the observation the framework is built on. The person who ends up taking your share is rarely someone who seemed like they would. This is the most quoted framework in the book, and the one that sounds cynical until you notice what it's actually saying. Ringer says, everyone you deal with falls into one of 3 categories. Type number 1 tells you openly, from the beginning, that he intends to take everything he can. He doesn't pretend otherwise. And then that is precisely what he tries to do. Type number 2 assures you that he has no interest in taking what's yours. He'll say it warmly, and he'll say it early. And then he will try to take everything he can. Type number 3 genuinely means it when he says he wants you to get your fair share. He is not lying. He believes it at the moment he says it. And then, when the deal is closing, and the money is real, and there's a reason available to him, he will rationalize his way into taking it anyway. It's worth sitting with the third one, because it's the type that actually gets you. Type 1 is easy, he told you. You can price him in from the first meeting. Type 2 is a familiar shape too. The warm assurance that nobody asked for is its own signal, and most experienced people learn to hear it. Type 3 is the problem, because Type 3 is sincere. He's the one you like. He's the one you'd describe to a friend as a good guy, and you'd be right, he is. He isn't running a con. What happens to him is that the deal reaches the end, the money becomes concrete rather than theoretical, and a reason appears. Not a lie, a reason. The market shifted. Your involvement was less central than it looked at the time. The other side is being difficult, and someone has to absorb it. He didn't set out to take your share. He arrived at a place where taking it felt defensible, and the human capacity for finding a situation defensible when it happens to be profitable is close to unlimited. Ringer's point is not that Type 3 is secretly wicked. It's that sincerity is a state, not a guarantee, and states change under pressure. Now look at what those three have in common. All of them end up in the same place. The difference between them is not the outcome, it's only how honestly they described the outcome in advance. Which means the framework isn't really a way of sorting people, it's an argument that sorting people is a waste of time. Reading someone's character, deciding whether they seem trustworthy, going with your gut about who's decent. Ringer's claim is that this whole activity has almost no predictive value, because sincerity at the start doesn't survive contact with a large amount of money at the end. And that leads to the one conclusion the framework exists to produce. Since you cannot tell in advance who will take your chips, stop trying and protect yourself identically from everyone. Not with suspicion, not by treating people as enemies. Structurally, in writing, in advance. I want to be careful here, because this is the idea most likely to be taken badly. Ringer is describing adversarial transactions between parties with money at stake. He is not describing your friendships, your marriage, or your team. Applied there, this framework is poison, and I'll come back to that at the end. But inside the thing it's actually about, it's hard to argue with. If your protection depends on the other party remaining the person they were in the first meeting, you don't have protection. You have a hope. Idea 3. Ringer tried both obvious answers first, and both failed. This is the most useful section of the book, because it's a record of being wrong twice before being right. The first approach he tried was the tough guy. He had watched operators in his industry who dominated rooms. Loud, hard, unpleasant men who seemed to get their way through sheer force of personality. And when you're being taken advantage of, the natural conclusion is that you're too soft, so he tried it. It didn't work, and the reason is precise. Aggression is a performance, and everyone in a deal is a professional audience for performances. When an aggressive posture isn't backed by any actual leverage, it doesn't read as strength. It reads as anxiety, with the volume turned up. And it converts people who would have been neutral into people who now want you to lose. The second approach was the opposite. Be the nicest, most useful, hardest working person in the transaction. Deliver more than you promised. Be endlessly accommodating. Absorb cost. Never make anything difficult. The theory being that if you are demonstrably valuable and pleasant, people will want to treat you fairly. This is the one most of you are running right now, and it failed worse than the first. Because here's the thing about being maximally accommodating. It is not neutral. It's information. Every time you absorb a cost without comment, you're demonstrating what you'll tolerate, and you're doing it in front of people who are professionally attentive to exactly that signal. Being easy to deal with is read, correctly, as being easy to remove. If you want to know whether you're running approach 2, there's a simple test. Think about the last time a client or a partner asked for something outside what was agreed. Extra work, a faster turnaround, a cost you weren't supposed to carry. Did you say yes immediately and then privately feel the weight of it? That's the pattern, and the trap in it is that saying yes feels like an investment. It feels like you're building goodwill you'll be able to draw on later. But goodwill isn't a bank. Nobody is keeping your balance. What you're actually building is a record of what you'll absorb without objection, and that record is being read. Ringer's conclusion is that both approaches failed for the same underlying reason. Both were attempts to influence the other person's willingness to treat him fairly. One through fear, one through goodwill, and that willingness turns out to be an unreliable thing to build an income on. So the third approach isn't a personality at all, it's a structure. Be genuinely good at the work. The first approach's rudeness was never necessary. Be pleasant, the second approach's warmth was never the problem. And separately from both, make it mechanically impossible to be cut out. Do the work of approach 2. Add the protection that neither approach had. Idea 4. Posture. Posture is Ringer's word for the impression you create before you've said anything about the deal, and his claim is that it does more work than most of the arguments you'll make afterwards. His own version of this was theatrical and, by his account, extremely effective. He formed a corporation with a serious-sounding name rather than operating as a man with business cards. He produced an expensive, heavy, beautifully made brochure at a time when brokers handed out photocopies. He hired a lawyer and put him in the room. He flew first class to meetings. He arrived looking like an organization rather than an individual. None of this improved a single deal on its merits. All of it changed how people behaved toward him, and the behavior is what determined the money. The mechanism he's describing is simple. When someone is deciding whether they can remove you from a transaction, they're making a risk assessment. A sole operator who seems to need the deal is low risk to cut out. An entity that appears to have lawyers, infrastructure, and other options is expensive to cross. Nothing about the underlying work changed. The estimated cost of mistreating him did. He pairs this with what he calls the leapfrog theory, the idea that you don't have to climb a hierarchy one rung at a time, waiting your turn, because there is no rule enforcing the queue. Position yourself as though you're already operating at the level you intend to occupy, and, more often than people expect, you'll simply be treated as though you are. 2 honest cautions on this, because posture is the part of the book that ages worst. The first, this can collapse into pure theater. Posture attached to real competence accelerates you. Posture attached to nothing gets you 1 meeting and a reputation. The second is financial, and it's serious. Ringer spent real money on image before he had the income to justify it, and he presents that as boldness. For most people, it's just an expensive way to run out of runway. The cheap forms of posture, being prepared, being specific, having your paperwork in order, not appearing to need the deal, do most of the work at none of the cost. Idea 5. Get it in writing, and get it signed by everyone. Here's the strange thing about this book. It's remembered for attitude, and the change that actually transformed Ringer's results was administrative. He started getting his commission agreements signed in advance, in writing, legally binding, acknowledged by every party to the transaction, not just the one who hired him, executed before he'd handed over the information that made him removable. That's it. That's the mechanism underneath all the theory. And notice what it does. It removes the entire question of whether the people you're dealing with are decent. Type 1, Type 2, Type 3, under a signed agreement, they produce the same outcome, because the outcome is no longer a function of their character. The reason this is hard is not legal, it's social. Asking for the paperwork, early, before there's any trouble, feels like an accusation. It feels like you're saying you don't trust them, and you're saying it at the exact moment when everyone is being friendly and optimistic, and the relationship feels good. That feeling is the intimidation. That's what the title is about. The pressure that stops you protecting yourself is almost never a threat. It's the fear of a slightly awkward conversation with someone who is currently being nice to you. Ringer's answer is to make it not a judgment about them. It's simply how you work. It happens on every deal, with everyone, at the same stage, without exception. A policy applied universally isn't an insult. It's only an insult when you apply it selectively, which is exactly what your instincts will tell you to do. It also helps enormously to have the words ready in advance, because the reason people skip this step is almost never that they decided not to do it. It's that the moment arrived, the room was friendly, and nothing came out. The shape that works is short, early, and boring. Something close to, before we go further, I'll send over the standard agreement. I do this on every deal. It takes 5 minutes, and it protects both of us. No justification, no apology, no explanation of why you've learned to do this. The moment you explain, you've made it a negotiation about your feelings instead of a step in a process. And notice the timing. Early is the whole thing. Asked at the start, it's administration. Asked once you've already handed over the work, it's a demand. Because by then, the other side has everything they needed from you, and the request has changed from a formality into a confrontation you will probably lose. He adds the better deal theory as the reason none of this is personal. People leave when something better appears, not because they're wicked, because they're responsive to incentives, like everyone including you. If your position depends on nothing better ever showing up, you don't have a position. Idea 6. Expect the negative result. Everything so far has been about structure. This one is about what you carry between deals. And it's the idea in the book most likely to change how your week feels, rather than how your contracts read. Ringer gives this one a deliberately absurd name, the theory of sustenance of a positive attitude through the assumption of a negative result. And underneath the joke is something genuinely useful and slightly at odds with most of this genre. The instruction is to assume, going in, that any given deal will fall apart. Not to work less on it, to work exactly as hard while expecting nothing. Two things follow. The first is emotional. If you've assumed a deal will collapse, its collapse doesn't take you with it. You've already priced it in, and that matters, because in a business of long cycles and frequent failure, the thing that destroys people isn't the failure rate, it's the recovery time after each one. The second is strategic, and more interesting. The person who is certain a deal must close is the person who will accept a worse share to save it. Expecting nothing removes exactly the desperation the other side is reading. You cannot be leveraged with the threat of losing something you weren't counting on. He backs it with two ideas that function as perspective devices. The Uncle George theory of reality. Reality is not what you wish it were, and not what it appears to be. It's what it actually is, whether that suits you or not. Most bad decisions in a deal come from arguing with the facts rather than working from them. And the ice ball theory, the earth will eventually be a frozen ball. Everyone in this transaction will be long forgotten, and nothing here is as consequential as it feels at 2 in the morning. It sounds like nihilism. It functions as a nerve steadier. It's much easier to hold a position when you've properly registered that the outcome isn't life or death. Idea 7. The negotiation is mostly over before it starts. The last thing worth pulling out of this book isn't a named theory, it's a pattern running underneath all of them. Almost every recommendation Ringer makes happens before the moment of conflict. The paperwork is signed before the information is handed over. The corporation exists before the first meeting. The expectation of failure is set before the deal begins. The decision about what you'll accept is made while you're calm, not while someone is looking at you across a table waiting for an answer. That's not an accident, and it's the most transferable idea here. Because the moment of pressure is the worst possible time to determine your position. Everything about it is designed against you. There's an audience, there's momentum, there's a relationship you'd rather not damage, and there's a clock. People who are excellent at their work and terrible at collecting for it are almost never people who lack judgment. They're people who made the decision in the wrong place, with a friendly face 2 feet away. Ringer's answer is to move the decision. Work out, in advance and alone, what your terms are and what you'll do if they're refused. Then the meeting stops being where you decide anything. It becomes where you report a decision that was already made. That is what not being intimidated actually looks like. It isn't nerve in the moment, it's having removed the need for nerve in the moment. Now the honest part. First, this is one man's memoir, not evidence. Every theory in it is illustrated by Ringer's own deals, remembered by Ringer, and credited by Ringer to Ringer's framework. There's no way to know how many people did the same things and failed, because those people don't write books. Read it as a well-observed account of one industry, not as a validated model. Second, it's 1973, and it shows. The world it describes is commercial real estate in a particular American decade, before email, before the internet, before a buyer could find a seller without a broker in 90 seconds. Some of the advice is specific to a bottleneck that no longer exists. The heavy brochure and the first-class flight belong to a signaling environment that has largely been replaced. Third, the money warning. And take this one seriously. Ringer spent heavily on image before he had revenue and presents it as courage. For someone with capital and a pipeline, that's a bet. For someone without, it is the fastest way to fail while looking successful. If you take one thing from this section, the free versions of posture, preparation, specificity, paperwork, not visibly needing the deal, deliver most of the benefit and cost nothing. Fourth, and most important, the 3 types framework is corrosive outside its habitat. Inside a negotiation between parties with money at stake, assume everyone will act in their own interest and protect yourself structurally is sober advice. Carried into your marriage, your friendships, or your team, it becomes a way of manufacturing the adversaries it warned you about. Ringer is describing a specific and unusually predatory environment. He is not describing people. A reader who generalizes this book into a worldview ends up lonely and still not rich. And fifth, the thing the book is least honest about. Ringer's approach works best for someone who already has options. Insisting on a signed agreement before you hand over your work is straightforward when you can afford to lose the deal, and very difficult when you cannot pay rent without it. The book presents the choice as a matter of nerve. Often it's a matter of runway. If you're not in a position to walk away, the honest first move isn't posture, it's building enough margin that you can afford to have one. Take the structure, take the paperwork, take the observation that stated intent doesn't predict behavior when the money arrives. Leave the theater and leave the worldview. Come back to that broker, 14 months in, watching 2 people he introduced decide between themselves what he was worth. The thing he eventually understood is the thing this whole video is about. He wasn't losing because he was worse. He was losing because he had entered one competition, who does the best work, and the money was being awarded in a different one entirely, which he hadn't noticed was running. The people beating him weren't better, they were simply playing the game that paid. And I want to be careful about what that does and doesn't mean, because there's a bad reading of this book that turns people cynical, and a good one that just makes them harder to take from. The bad reading is that the work doesn't matter. It does. None of Ringer's protection would have earned him anything if the deals weren't real. The good reading is narrower and more useful. Doing excellent work and collecting what it's worth are 2 separate skills, and most people who feel underpaid have spent their entire careers practicing only the first one, then treating the second as somebody else's responsibility. There's a version of that realization that curdles, and I'd rather you didn't take it. The point isn't that everyone is against you. Most people aren't thinking about you at all. That's precisely the issue. Your interests are not on anyone else's agenda, not because they're hostile, but because they're busy with their own. Expecting otherwise is the actual mistake, and it's a mistake about attention rather than about morality. Nobody is coming to award you your share. That's the whole book. So here's my question for you. What's the last thing you did brilliantly and got nothing for? And looking back, what was the exact moment you could have protected yourself and didn't because it would have felt awkward? Put it in the comments. That specific moment is the most useful thing anyone can share under this video, and I'd like to read them. If this gave you something worth thinking about, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We break down one great book like this every week. Do the work, then go and collect it. Stay sharp. I'll see you in the next one.